Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Word Wednesday. Geoffrey Nance here coming to you, talking a little bit more about this idea of raising children and what that ought to look like. So, last week we talked about the idea of train up a child in the way that he should go, and in the end, he will not depart from it. So, we talked a little about what that could mean and what it means for any of us to go into training and what is required there for that. And today, I want to pick up a little bit on what not to do, right? What not to do with our kids. And so, just to review a little bit, let me read Deuteronomy 6 for you guys. This kind of gives us an idea of what we talked a little bit about last week, what we're supposed to be about as parents when it comes to pastoring our kids, which is our responsibility, not ministers. They have their role. I was in ministry for over 2 decades. Um, so very, very important role that those people play in our kids' lives, no doubt about that. So appreciative of people that are out there working, doing that role. Um, they have a tremendous amount of influence on our kids. And I appreciate the work that all of those people are doing. Deuteronomy 6 says this: These commands I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And it's this idea that this should be permeating essentially every element of our lives. Like we ought to be actively engaging our children in thinking about God, and not only just thinking about God, but applying His words, His truth to their lives in the various situations that they'll encounter. I remember being in youth ministry, and people would say, well, it just seems like things are so different today than they were back in my day. And I would always tell them, no, that's not the case. They have similar pressures. Some things are different, but for the most part, sin is still sin. And they're still going to be tempted by those things. People are still people, and they um, are are going to do what teenagers do. They're going to struggle with trying to figure out who they are, who they want to be, who they are in Christ. They're going to struggle with how to treat each other. And we'll see. Do they do the things that Christ has laid out for them? Do they act like that? Are they nice to each other, encouraging to one another? Are they witnessing? Those kinds of things. That none of that has changed. And then temptation to follow the crowd. That's been there, for ages and ages and ages, right? So you're going to do good things, healthy things, or not. So some of those things haven't changed. And today specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about what not to do, and a little bit of telling you guys how I feel like I've kind of messed up a little bit. So I'm going to tell you first about a story that I remember experiencing as a teenager. I saw a parent, it was a dad in particular, very, very hard on his kids. And he had a son, two sons, but one of them in particular was a really good athlete, a good football player. And he was playing in a game, and he was up against one of the better players in the state. This guy was that he was up against was a two-way player. He played quarterback on offense, and he was a defensive back on defense. And this guy that I'm telling you about was a receiver, and he was going up against this guy. So they didn't throw it to him. They didn't throw it to him because they were so afraid of this, highly ranked player that they were up against. They wouldn't throw it to him. And finally, they got down so much that they decided to start throwing it his way. Well, he caught a touchdown, and then I think he got another touchdown. He scored 2 touchdowns, and he caught, just anytime they would throw it to him, he was making plays on this guy. And then it came a critical fourth down play. This team finally started to make a comeback. They were, moving the ball, and he dropped it. he dropped a 4th down pass, and the team ended up losing. So he had over 100 yards. He had multiple touchdowns on this guy who was an all-state defensive back. 2 touchdowns, over 100 yards, making plays. First thing his dad says to him is, "You dropped the ball. You dropped the ball on that 4th down play. You cost your team. That play ruined it for your whole team. They needed you to come through with a big play, and you dropped the ball." And I remember thinking, what? He If they had thrown in the ball more earlier in the game, it might have made a difference. This guy had a great game. That defensive back I was telling you about that this player was going up against went on to play Division I college football and is now an all-pro, or was an all-pro a few years ago, in the National Football League. This teenager I'm telling you about had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns going up against him, and the first thing this guy's dad says to him is not, "Hey, man, you had a great game against an all-state football player." It's, "You dropped the ball on 4th down. You cost your team the game." And I remember this guy just hanging his head and thinking, "I can't ever do enough to please my dad." And I was sitting there thinking, golly, are you serious right now? That's what you're going to come with. You've not how great a game he had, not how great a season he's had, but you're going to focus on one pass. Yes, it was huge, right? He dropped a 4th down pass, but they wouldn't have been close to that pass mattering if he hadn't made those other plays. And here this dad approaches him and, like, he points out the one thing that he messed up on that game. And I just remember the guy he just sunk his head, and I was like, "Dude, are you kidding me right now?" So this guy had incredible potential. He ended up and he went to, like, I think a Division III school, and then he eventually didn't make it there. He just faded out even at that. So he just didn't make it. He didn't go any further past that. And I just remember thinking, what a waste, right? What a waste of talent, and that just stemmed from this just overbearing parent that is just pointing out anything his kid did wrong rather than praising him for what he did right. And so I just remember seeing that and going, I don't ever want to be that way. And then I had a son who was gifted. He was athletic, and so I was coaching his soccer teams. And I remember I didn't want him to, I didn't want the other kids to be like, "Hey, you favor your son." And so I ended up kind of going the opposite way. And I remember I was just very critical and harsh of what Braden did wrong. And I'd point it out. And then I remember as we were growing up, I mean, we were a really good team. Like, we went undefeated multiple seasons. We were a traveling team, undefeated multiple times. And it got to a point where even I saw the other kids start to get on to Braden and be like, "Oh, Braden, you didn't make this play. Oh, Braden, you didn't do this." I'm like, "Hey, you guys chill out. I'm the coach. I got this." But they had picked that up from me. And so now they were blaming him for not making plays when they needed to be more concerned about themselves and the plays that they weren't making. And I remember thinking, how did I get here? How did I end up being this dad? This example that I saw, that I said I never want to be like this. How did I get here? How did I get to this point? And I remember being very disappointed and going, how am I going to fix this? How am I going to make this right? And by then it had been established. I was like, it was crazy. I was just like, how did I end up being that guy where I was the one that I was going to criticize rather than encourage and lift up? And Braden has a bit of an ego. He's very high on himself, and I thought maybe I needed to somehow bring that down a little bit. But I didn't end up doing that really. I just ended up really kind of, I think, failing in that area where he needed me most, was to encourage him, to get him to like the game and to do his very best. And that brings me to two passages I want to read to you. Colossians chapter 3, verse 20 says, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord." And as a parent, we love to quote that verse, don't we? Right? Our kids come up, they don't listen to us. We'll go quote that verse. Hey, obey me in everything. But I think we have a tendency to miss the verse that comes directly after that. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Guys, listen, part of our jobs as parents, particularly as fathers, especially if we have people that do something we do, whether this is sports or whether it's some musical instrument or whatever it is. It could be like drama or whatever. Whatever your thing is, where you've got a kid that's trying to follow you and do something similar. You want our kids to obey. I remember having a parent as a youth minister, and she dropped her kid off and was like, "Hey, I can't fix her. Can you?" And I remember thinking, no, no. I mean, I'll tell her about Jesus, but she's with me for a couple of hours a week. She's with you for hours every single day. You, according to the Bible, are supposed to be her primary spiritual influence. I will try to teach her the things, but we saw this being played out in this parent's lives. And unfortunately, I saw several that were like this, where they took on this mantra where they say, "Do as I say, not as I do." Well, guys, I want to challenge you to realize that that's as horrible as it actually sounds. Because for kids, they say more is caught than what is taught. And therefore, we are to set an example. So when we see things in our kids that we don't like, there's a high probability that it's something they caught from us. My wife and I just had this conversation because our oldest son, he doesn't like to ever take the blame for anything. Right? It's just like he's going to put it off on somebody else. Well, if you had done this, then I wouldn't have been this, or it's so and so's fault. I'm like, no, 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 no. You take responsibility for you. My wife had to sit me down and I don't ever like these kind of conversations, but she's like, the other day when you didn't, pack Allie, put Allie's lunch in her box or make sure she had it. I'm like, well, I asked her, was it ready? She said, yes. I said, do you have everything? She said, yes. I assumed that I did my part. And Brandy's like, well, you didn't follow through. She didn't have her lunch. And then I ended up taking it to school. And she's like, that would have been a good time for you to admit that you didn't do what you're supposed to do. I'm like, I did what I'm supposed to do. I asked her, do you have your lunch ready? Is it in your backpack? Or do you have everything? She's like, no, but the point was you didn't do what I asked you to do. And you could have taken responsibility and did that. Well, in that instance, here I am doing the very thing that I don't like that my oldest son does. Did I do what I was supposed to do? No. Did I think I did enough? Yes. Did I do everything I was supposed to? No. Did I set a good example? No, I didn't. Right. And then that's the reality that I needed to say in that instance. You know what? I'm sorry. I did not respond accordingly. And our kids need to hear that from us. They need to hear us say that we're sorry. They need to hear us say that we're wrong. One more thing while we're on this topic. Ephesians 3:20 says, "Children, obey your parents and everything." Guys, have a reason for why you're telling them to do something. I remember when my parents used to say, "Because I told you so." I hated that. Hated that. I mean, and I know I'm supposed to obey, but tell me why. Like I don't. I mean, we don't. Our kids shouldn't question everything that we say. I'm not advocating that. That's horrible, right? But we ought to have a reason why we're saying that. Now, there are some times, like if your kid's about to run out on the road, you say, stop. You just expect them to do that. You don't need a response like, hey, stop. Listen to what I'm saying because you're about to get hurt. But if it's something where you're like, hey, I don't want you to do this or I do want you to do that, explain it to them. And better yet, show them. Show them in the word, right? Why we're saying what we're saying. And then live that out. But don't embitter your children. Don't do this horrible thing where you say, hey, listen to my words, not my actions, because that's not how it works. We're supposed to follow Jesus, right? Be perfect as he is perfect. And then when it comes to our kids, we do it in word and deed, not just word or deed, word and deed. It's got to be both. It's got to be both. And then I'm gonna close with this. In Ephesians chapter 6, it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." And then verse 4, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." What a great way to combine these last two lessons that we've had. All right. So, fathers, do not exasperate your children, but bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. Guys, how does Jesus treat us as his children? Did he set an example in both word and deed? Take that as a rhetorical question. Absolutely, the answer is yes, right? So we too have this great privilege and responsibility as parents to raise up our kids and then to not exasperate or embitter them, but to set an example for them in the way that they should go so that when they're old, they will not depart from that, guys. Those of you guys who are parents, grandparents, just want to encourage you a little bit today um, to be honest about where you are and this great role and responsibility we have. And then to just to remind us, right? Yes, we want our children to obey, but then let's show them why. Let's tell them why. Let's have a reason why we're doing what we're doing, and then to explain that to them from a biblical perspective in the training and instruction of the Lord. Thanks for being with us today, guys. Hope that this is helpful. If you feel like somebody else might benefit from this, feel free to share that with them. If you want to learn more, we have an opportunity available called Little Builders. It's a different approach to raising up kids when it comes to education. If you guys want to know more about that, we posted several things here, so that's available to you. And again, it deals with how to build up kids from a different educational perspective. So we know that we have a responsibility as parents to train our kids up in the way that they should go, but to train and instruct them in the way of the Lord and to do so in both word and deed without embittering them and without exasperating them. All right, guys, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate each one of you. And as you go about parenting, be patient, be loving, and be setting an example for them to see Christ in and through you.